He was born at Derby in 1820. In both lines, his ancestors were nonconformists or dissenters. His father's mother had been a devoted follower of John Wesley. His father's brother, Thomas, though an Anglican clergyman, led a Wesleyan movement within the church, never attended a concert or a play, and took an active part in movements for political reform. This drive to heresy became stronger in the father and culminated in the almost obstinate individualism of Herbert Spencer himself. The father never used the supernatural to explain anything. He was described by one acquaintance, though Herbert considered this an exaggeration, as without faith or religion whatever, so far as one could see. He was inclined to science and wrote an inventional geometry. In politics, he was an individualist like his son and would never take off his hat to anyone, no matter of what rank. If he did not understand some question my mother put, he would remain silent, not asking what the question was, and letting it go unanswered. He continued this course all through his life, notwithstanding its futility. There resulted no improvement. One is reminded, except for the silence, of Herbert Spencer's resistance in his later years to the extension of state functions. The father, as well as an uncle and a paternal grandfather, were teachers of private schools, and yet the son, who was to be the most famous English philosopher of his century, remained till 40 an uneducated man. Herbert was lazy, and the father was indulgent. At last, when he was 13, Herbert was sent to Hinton to study under his uncle, who had a reputation for severity. But Herbert promptly ran away from the uncle and trudged all the way back to the paternal home at Derby, 48 miles the first day, 47 the next, and 20 the third, all on a little bread and beer. Nevertheless, he returned to Hinton after a few weeks and stayed for 3 years. It was the only systematic schooling that he ever received. He could not say later just what it was he learned there. No history, no natural science, no general literature. He says, with characteristic pride, that neither in boyhood nor youth did I receive a single lesson in English, and that I have remained entirely without formal knowledge of syntax down to the present hour, are facts which should be known, since their implications are at variance with assumptions universally accepted. At the age of 40, he tried to read the Iliad, but after reading some 6 books, I felt what a task it would be to go on, felt that I would rather give a large sum than read to the end. Collier, one of his secretaries, tells us that Spencer never finished any book of science. Even in his favorite fields, he received no systematic instruction. He burnt his fingers and achieved a few explosions in chemistry. He browsed entomologically among the bugs about school and home, and he learned something about strata and fossils in his later work as a civil engineer. For the rest, he picked his science casually as he went along. Until he was 30, he had no thought at all of philosophy. Then he read Lewis and tried to pass on to Kant, but finding at the outset that Kant considered space and time to be forms of sense perception rather than objective things, he decided that Kant was a dunce and threw the book away. His secretary tells us that Spencer composed his first book, Social Statics, having read no other ethical treatise than an old and now forgotten book by Jonathan Diamond. He wrote his Psychology after reading only Hume, Mansell, and Reid, his Biology after reading only Carpenter's Comparative Physiology, and not The Origin of Species, his Sociology without reading Comte or Tyler, his Ethics without reading Kant or Mill or any other moralist than Sedgwick. What a contrast to the intensive and relentless education of John Stuart Mill. Where, then, did he find those myriad facts with which he propped up his 1,000 arguments? He picked them up, for the most part, by direct observation rather than by reading. His curiosity was ever awake, and he was continually directing the attention of his companion to some notable phenomenon, until then seen by his eyes alone. At the Athenaeum Club, he pumped Huxley and his other friends almost dry of their expert knowledge, and he ran through the periodicals at the club as he had run through those that passed through his father's hands for the Philosophical Society at Derby, lynx-eyed for every fact that was grist to his mill. Having determined what he wanted to do, and having found the central idea, evolution, about which all his work would turn, his brain became a magnet for relevant material, and the unprecedented orderliness of his thought classified the material almost automatically as it came. No wonder the proletaire and the businessman heard him gladly. Here was just such a mind as their own, a stranger to book learning, innocent of culture, and yet endowed with the natural, matter-of-fact knowledge of the man who learns as he works and lives. For he was working for his living, and his profession intensified the practical tendency of his thought. He was surveyor, supervisor, and designer of railway lines and bridges, and in general an engineer. He dripped inventions at every turn. They all failed, but he looked back upon them in his autobiography with the fondness of a father for a wayward son. He sprinkled his reminiscent pages with patent salt cellars, jugs, candle extinguishers, invalid chairs, and the like. As most of us do in youth, he invented new diets, too. For a time he was vegetarian, but he abandoned it when he saw a fellow vegetarian develop anemia and himself losing strength. I found that I had to rewrite what I had written during the time I was a vegetarian because it was so wanting in vigor. He was ready in those days to give everything a trial. He even thought of migrating to New Zealand, forgetting that a young country has no use for philosophers. It was characteristic of him that he made parallel lists of reasons for and against the move, giving each reason a numerical value. The sums being 110 points for remaining in England and 301 for going, he remained. His character had the defects of its virtues. He paid for his resolute realism and practical sense by missing the spirit and zest of poetry and art. The only poetical touch in his 20 volumes was due to a printer who made Spencer speak of the daily versification of scientific predictions. He had a fine persistence whose other side was an opinionated obstinacy. He could sweep the entire universe for proofs of his hypotheses, but he could not see with any insight another's point of view. He had the egotism that bears up the nonconformer, and he could not carry his greatness without some conceit. He had the limitations of the pioneer, a dogmatic narrowness accompanying a courageous candor and an intense originality, sternly resisting all flattery, rejecting proffered governmental honors, and pursuing his painful work for 40 years in chronic ill health and modest seclusion. And yet marked, by some phrenologist who gained access to him, self-esteem very large. The son and grandson of teachers, he wielded the ferule in his books and struck a high didactic tone. "I am never puzzled," he tells us. His solitary bachelor life left him lacking in the warmly human qualities, though he could be indignantly humane. He had an affair with that great Englishwoman, George Eliot, but she had too much intellect to please him. He lacked humor, and had no subtlety or nuances in his style. When he lost at his favorite game of billiards, he denounced his opponent for devoting so much time to such a game as to have become an expert in it. In his autobiography, he writes reviews of his own early books to show how it should have been done. Apparently, the magnitude of his task compelled him to look upon life with more seriousness than it deserves. "I was at the fête of Saint-Cloud on Sunday," he writes from Paris, "and was much amused by the juvenility of the adults. The French never entirely cease to be boys. I saw gray-haired people riding on whirligigs such as we have at our own fairs." He was so busy analyzing and describing life that he had no time to live it. After seeing Niagara Falls, he jotted down in his diary, "Much what I had expected." He describes the most ordinary incidents with the most magnificent pedantry, as when he tells us of the only time he ever swore. He suffered no crisis, felt no romance, if his memoirs record him well. He had some intimacies, but he writes of them almost mathematically. He plots the curves of his tepid friendships without any uplifting touch of passion. A friend said of himself that he could not write well when dictating to a young woman stenographer. Spencer said that it did not bother him at all. His secretary says, "The passion